So, folks, we got to talk about the Voting Rights Act, and very specifically how the Supreme Court has utterly destroyed it. Now, for those of you who don't know much about the Voting Rights Act, what it does, etc., its history, I think maybe one of the things that we should do here is go back to the roots of the Voting Rights Act. And I think that this is important because you need to understand that what the Trump administration has done, and in fact, what what the Supreme Court has done under John Roberts is one of those nakedly unforgivable things. Like, this is the Calais decision is basically going to go down as like, of a kind with all the horrid decisions of the Supreme Court. It's going to be one of those decisions that goes down in infamy in our history. And one of the things I want to talk about is just kind of how this all what is the Voting Rights Act? Why do we even need this? Right? Well, basically, folks, after the Civil War, you had the freeing of the slaves, you had the Reconstruction era. And during the Reconstruction era, a lot of people don't know in the modern day because our history classes in high school are woefully insufficient. The voting environment for African Americans was actually full of opportunity. The Reconstruction amendments during this era, they were passed in relatively quick succession. You had the 13th Amendment in 1865, you had the 14th Amendment in 1868, and then you had the 15th Amendment in 1870, right? And you had this series of amendments passed in the Reconstruction era in order to basically solidify the rights of African Americans as newly freed peoples, right? Entitled to all of the rights and privileges of other, free folks. However, what ended up happening was Congress at the time, after the 15th Amendment was passed, sat down and looked at these amendments and said, you know what? We can actually see how this might not be good enough. And so in 1870, Congress passed what is referred to as the Enforcement Acts. These were intended to be kind of the acts of Congress that would act alongside the constitutional amendments to enforce the basic human rights of African Americans and to ensure that they had democratic rights within our political system. And these enforcement acts, you had the Enforcement Act of 1870, which was largely viewed as kind of this reaction to the Ku Klux Klan, because, in 1870, you started to get kind of this rising need among a lot of white Southerners to reassert their superiority. And Congress, of course, in the Reconstruction era, didn't really look too kindly on that. And this is the period that I've been referencing over the last few weeks when I talk about how Congress used its ability to kind of elevate a story by calling people in front of Congress in order to testify about their voting conditions, about the terror that the KKK had been intentionally spreading to them, their loved ones, the acts of violence that were prohibiting them from voting or participating in broader society. And this, this focus of Congress on elevating this story culminated in these different acts. So you have the Enforcement Act of 1870, which by and large barred any kind of discrimination by state officials when it comes to voter registration on the basis of race, color, conditions of servitude, etc. And it also gave penalties for stopping or interfering with a person's right to vote. And also gave the federal courts the right to enforce these penalties.
The Trump admin supports the voting rights. We do not support the voting left.
I mean, it genuinely, it is that hypocritical. Like, what has happened here is that bad. And I'm going to show you something after I'm done giving this history and we can get into what has happened to the Voting Rights Act to like kind of elaborate and demonstrate exactly what I need, courtesy of Senator Ted Cruz. But then you had kind of a recognition in Congress that, hey, perhaps the Enforcement Act of 1870 doesn't have sufficient protections or sufficient punishments. And so you had the Enforcement Act of 1871, which in turn brought harsher penalties and was viewed as kind of sharpening the edge of the 1870 Enforcement Act. Because the 1870 Enforcement Act also banned the use of terror, bribery, or any real effort of an individual private citizen to prevent people from voting on the basis of race. And there were other elements here that also just outright banned effectively the KKK. This resulted in hundreds of members of the KKK being arrested and tried as essentially terrorists. This was an act of Congress in the 1870s or 1870 and 1871, respectively, that effectively destroyed the ability of the Ku Klux Klan to operate, at least in its first incarnation. But you might be thinking to yourselves, hey, wait a minute, we've heard about the KKK a little bit more recently than 1870 and 1871. And that's, well, we'll get to that. Don't worry about it. And then you had you had the Ku Klux Klan Act, which, is a addition to the Enforcement Act of 1871. And basically, it just, again, specifically went after the KKK and allowed the president to suspend habeas corpus if the Ku Klux Klan was able to successfully resist the power of the federal government. Effectively saying, well, you know what, KKK, if you try and stop us from dissolving your organization, we are just going to straight up hold you without charges. That's kind of the end of the Enforcement Acts. So you have then this period where, Reconstruction goes on for several more years after the passage of the Enforcement Acts. And historians largely agree that Reconstruction ended in 1877. And you might have heard me say things like, we need to finish the process of Reconstruction, because Reconstruction was never finished. Instead, what wound up happening is that in 1875, the Supreme Court cut down major elements of the Enforcement Acts. This took place in the court cases United States versus Cruikshank and United States versus Reese, right? And the striking down of several of these provisions, specifically for things like federal oversight of the electoral process, federal mandating of voter registration, etc. This then set the stage for discrimination to take hold, and basically it empowered the Southern white representatives and senators. And that in turn allowed for them to de facto end Reconstruction without it actually having been ended. And as you then go forward from around 1877, you have the dissolution of the Enforcement Acts. You have Congress repealing them or, watering them down to the point of, ineffectiveness. You have like this new era where effectively by 1894, the Enforcement Acts have been detoothed, defanged. This in turn allows for the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, which is, an era that you may now be more familiar with, kind of their second uprising. So where does that get us? Well, that gets us to the introduction of Jim Crow laws. You get the formalization of an apartheid system on the state level, in particular, across the South. though, of course, northern states are not immune to the spread of these Jim Crow laws. And then you have the civil rights movement. And this civil rights movement, really surges into being in, the late 1930s and like continues to percolate into the 1950s when it really comes into its own. And that's when you start seeing the Civil Rights Act of 1957. You start seeing the Civil Rights Act of 1960, but you don't really see a resurgence of any kind of legislation to protect African American voter rights in this country until 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And you only really get this because Lyndon B. Johnson, right, is elected. And he's too cowardly to actually introduce the Voting Rights Act of 1965 right away. However, he does direct his DOJ to essentially come up with. There's a quote here. Let's see if I can pull it up real quick. Yes, he directed his attorney general to draft, quote, the goddamnedest, toughest Voting Rights Act that you can. So he had the legislation drafted up after he's elected. And, he's trying, like he passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But it isn't until after his election, the elections of 1964, in which he wins this overwhelming majority, that he directs this legislation to be drafted. And at that point, he's too afraid to really introduce it. So what winds up forcing his hand? Well, that will be some of the most famous acts of civil disobedience, some of the most famous acts of the civil rights movement. Specifically, you have a confluence of, Martin Luther King Jr., you have, Malcolm X, you have the marches in Selma that wind up capturing, the attention of the entire country, right? So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they are trying to force Lyndon B. Johnson's hand. They're trying to make it clear that there is a need for Voting Rights Act legislation. And so they all come down on Selma, Alabama. And this is where you get famous footage of, Jim Clark's police dogs being let loose onto nonviolent protesters. You get the hoses. It is then burned into the American memory because you have television cameras, you have photographers there. It is documented. It is put in front of the faces of the American public, specifically the white American public, who for far too long has kind of lived in this world where, like, they know that there's discrimination going on, but they're comfortable with it as long as it doesn't look too ugly, right? And you've got Martin Luther King Jr. going down there and organizing several of these major nonviolent, peaceful demonstrations. And you get, counter protesters who are, saying the most vile things imaginable. You've got the police violence and the counter protester violence, of course. And then Malcolm X shows up shortly after all of these horrific acts of violence and basically gives a speech in Selma where he talks about how many African Americans basically aren't on board with nonviolence and are increasingly growing more prone to committing acts of violence. Like there's going to be a levee that breaks somewhere, and there's going to be violence as a result of the violence being inflicted on the African American community. If you're ever looking around the modern internet and you're like, hey, why are these online leftists saying such inflammatory things sometimes? Why won't that Hassan say that he'd vote for the lesser of two evils, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Well, it's kind of a similar thing to what Malcolm X did during the day, because, again, after he gave that speech about the inevitability of violence, he had privately talked about how he basically gave that speech in order to be kind of the counterbalance intentionally to Martin Luther King Jr., specifically saying if essentially white people wouldn't empathize with Martin Luther King's nonviolence and the violence being inflicted upon these nonviolent protesters, then he would act as the firebrand that would make them afraid and out of fear support Martin Luther King Jr.'s reforms. And this is also where you get Martin Luther King Jr. being arrested on like anti-parade ordinances, and he writes the letter from a Selma jail, right? And so like you've got all of this going on, and ultimately that forces Johnson's hand, because he's looking at what is happening here and says, okay, like we need to actually push this through now. My fears and the fears of my advisors be damned. And so they do this. Wasn't it letter from a Birmingham jail, or am I mistaken? Letter from a Selma jail is a different letter, because again, Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't just arrested the one time, right? So letter from a Birmingham jail, different letter. Nope, letter from a Selma jail, different letter. Okay. So here's an excerpt from the Guild Earlman site, an excerpt from a letter from a Selma, Alabama jail. So this is kind of the context here. A major part of King's and the SCLC's political strategy for the Selma protest campaign involved drawing national news media attention to the political plight of Selma's largely disenfranchised black voters. On February 1st, 1965, King himself was purposefully arrested and jailed as part of the SCLC's strategy for drawing national attention to the Selma situation. Even before he was incarcerated, the SCLC had prepared a fund-solicited advertisement for publication in the New York Times that was designed to remind readers of King's already famous 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail. Yes. Okay. So basically, this isn't a letter that he wrote in the jail. It's part of the, essentially PR campaign being waged to strong arm the Johnson administration into passing the Voting Rights Act. So it was published the same day he emerged from jail. This is actually the full text of the letter, which I can read to you guys. Dear friends, when the King of Norway participated in awarding the Nobel Peace Prize to me, he surely did not think that in less than 60 days I would be in jail. He and almost all world opinion will be shocked because they are little aware of the unfinished business in the South. By jailing hundreds of Negroes, the city of Selma, Alabama has revealed the persisting ugliness of segregation to the nation and the world. When the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, many decent Americans were lulled into complacency because they thought the day of difficult struggle was over. Why are we in jail? Have you ever been required to answer 100 questions on government, some abstruse even to a political scientist specialist, merely to vote? Have you ever stood in line with over 100 others while waiting an entire day, seen less than 10 given the qualifying test? This is Selma, Alabama. There are more Negroes in jail with me than there are on the voting rolls. But apart from voting rights, merely to be a person in Selma is not easy. When reporters asked Sheriff Clark if a woman defendant was married, he replied, "She's a N-word woman, and she hasn't got a Miss or a Mrs. in front of her name." This is the USA in 1965. We are in jail simply because we cannot tolerate these conditions for ourselves or our nation. We need the help of all decent Americans. Our organization, SCLC, is not only working in Selma, Alabama, but in dozens of other southern communities. Our self-help projects operate in South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and other states. Our people are eager for work, to sacrifice, to be jailed, but their income, normally meager, is cut off in these crises. Your help can make the difference. Your help can be a message of unity, which the thickest jail walls cannot muffle. With warmest good wishes from all of us, sincerely, Martin Luther King Jr. So that is the excerpt from this particular letter being mentioned. And so you have all of this culminating in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, right? And basically, what the Voting Rights Act does is it creates a number of different mechanisms that, of course, is also iterated upon over time. This is basically an effort to outlaw things like poll taxes, poll tests, etc., basically to end all of the practices that up until then had been used to prevent African Americans from voting, from going to the polls, right? And it was fairly comprehensive. You've got a number of these things. Of course, again, it's iterated upon over time. So you have increasing efficacy added to it in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and even 2006, right? And part of the issue here is that the Voting Rights Act was written in a way where essentially Congress was like, well, we can foresee perhaps a point in the future in which the Voting Rights Act is no longer needed because there's no longer this discriminatory, set of attitudes or values. And so there is a requirement for it to be essentially like repassed or reaffirmed in Congress, reauthorized. So after 1965, it needed to be repassed in 1970 and reauthorized because essentially there's a recognition here that if it is not, all of the same discriminatory practices are going to go back into effect. This is an important provision of the Voting Rights Act in light of today, because as of yesterday, in a 6-3 ruling, the Supreme Court has essentially gutted the Voting Rights Act. And if you listen to conservatives on the Supreme Court, they're just retooling the language a little bit. We're just retooling it a little bit. But the argument that John Roberts actually gives when issuing his ruling essentially boils down to this idea of the turnout gap. And if you're wondering what that is, the turnout gap is essentially the gap between, how many black people turn out to vote in an election versus what percentage of white people turn out to vote. And so historically, there has been a lower percentage of black people turning out to vote compared to a higher percentage of white people. However, what is notable is that there are a couple exceptions to this, specifically when it comes to 2008 and 2012. Now, what happened in 2008 or 2012 that may have contributed to this? It was Barack Obama. Barack Obama was running for election and re-election specifically, and that boosted African American voter turnout to historically high levels. And what the conservatives on the court have been arguing ever since then, not just in this particular case to gut the Voting Rights Act, but in multiple other Supreme Court cases, is that those high rates of turnout, those 2 times, they basically mean racism is over.
Gap sounds like the store they made for Pride Month and then canceled from public pressure.
Everything's rainbows and glitter in the turnout gap. Indeed. Sake Tanuki, thank you for the 5 tier 1 subs. But yeah, basically the John Roberts Court has for its entire existence been arguing that, racism is done. Racism is over now, guys. Using the turnout gap, reversal from 2008 and 2012. Now, what's interesting about this is because there was another blow to the Voting Rights Act. And that blow happened in 2013. 1 year after the evidence that racism is done. Now, what on earth could that have done? Well, basically, I'm going to boil this down. Basically, it guts the Civil Rights Act in a different way. Okay? Basically, the idea being that, well, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act that requires states and local governments to obtain, essentially federal thumbs up before changing any of their voting laws or practices, and also thumbs up from the federal government to verify that they aren't racially gerrymandering their states. The Supreme Court says, nah, you don't have to do that anymore because racism is done. This decision comes down in 2013, right? And in ever since then, of course, the turnout gap has, of course, not returned to 2008-2012 levels, because immediately after Shelby, a lot of southern states redistricted and also changed their voting their voting policies, their voting locations, etc. If you've ever wondered why so many voter locations, like polling places, have been closed across the South in, for example, African American areas as opposed to white areas of the southern states, you can thank the Shelby County decision from the Supreme Court for that exact set of circumstances, right? And, well, of course, one would assume, so John Roberts' entire argument that racism is over would clearly be countered by the fact that it got the voting conditions of African Americans got worse after the Shelby decision. And you'd be wrong, because that is exactly the same argument that he used when it came to when it came to the decision yesterday. Here is John Roberts, I believe. As this court has observed, by 2004, the racial gap in voter registration and turnout had largely disappeared, with minorities registering and voting at levels that sometimes surpass the majority. Since 2000, and again, references the Shelby County case. Since 2004, black voters have turned out at higher rates than white voters in 2 of 5 presidential elections nationwide and in Louisiana. U.S. Census Bureau voting and registration tables, and as the evidence here, and the voter registration gap has not exceeded 6% nationally or 5% in Louisiana. Contrast that to 1965, when a 50-point gap marred much of the South, including Louisiana, right? So the argument here is racism is still done. Forget the fact that I have to go back 16 years for my example. Not even 16 years. Yeah, 16 years. No. 14 years to 2012 for my most recent example of this happening. This is just bullshit. This is what the turnout gap has been, okay? In federal elections. So the turnout gap, this is, you have 2008 and 2012, right? So the gap is close to zero because African Americans are voting at that high rate. But then you can see the turnout gap getting bigger over time for the African American community because of the racial discrimination that the Shelby County case codified. You can literally see the effects of the Shelby County case in this graph. It's very, very wild to me. And then below you have the gap for the midterms. And the gap for the midterms is, 10% plus. It goes almost all the way up to 20%. That's not to mention, of course, the gap between white folks and Latinos, non-white, Asians, etc. The idea that racism is over in this country when these massive gaps not only exist, but are going up is wild to me. And it really indicates how full of shit the Roberts Court is. It's one of the reasons why this decision is so odious. It's predicated on lies. Now, of course, you're going to hear Republicans, always very consistent, they're going to come out and be beating their chests about how awful this is, about how discriminatory this is, obviously,
I find it suspiciously that this Supreme Court ruling came around the time Trump begins attacking the SPLC.
Well, also, I mean, we haven't even really talked about that because that was happening while I was sick off stream. But like Donald Trump, the entire thing against the Southern Poverty Law Center about like, well, the SPLC was actually funding the KKK. They were funding goddamn informants in far right extremist organizations. They were paying people to take on extreme amounts of risk in order to bring down these organizations. That's not funding the orgs. It's so stupid. But there is an overlap between the arguments being made, for sure. Now, I just want to show you guys Ted Cruz, someone who is very upset that Democratic states are gerrymandering after Texas kicked this all off by gerrymandering itself.
Disenfranchise you. And by the way, all of the rural Virginians, Virginia is a big state. They drew these districts that all go into Northern Virginia so that their district is going to be controlled by liberal federal government workers. If you're in rural Virginia, apparently your rights don't matter. And every Democrat who came out for it, they had previously given all these speeches about the evils of gerrymandering. Understand, and this has been true for decades, the worst gerrymanderers in America are Democrats. You look at New England. In all of New England, you have one elected Republican. Massachusetts, the entire state, about 35% of the state of Massachusetts votes Republican. You know how many Republicans they elect? 0. California, already one of the most egregious gerrymanders in the country. They just drew it again to make it even more egregious. Illinois, the same way. And so Virginia, Democrats will do anything to stay in power, and the will of the voters doesn't matter. Anytime you see a Democrat beating his chest and saying, let's stand for democracy, their actions don't match up with their words.
So, of course, Ted Cruz is going to be first in line to like criticize the Supreme Court decision against the Voting Rights Act of 1965, right? Oh, what's that? No, Republicans are just weirdly either quiet about this or incredibly giddy about it. Wait, what's that? Immediately after the Supreme Court decision, we had Louisiana's governor prepared to suspend House primaries. Yeah, that's right. The Republican governor of Louisiana is preparing to suspend all Republican House candidates to basically pause their elections so that lawmakers in the state can redistrict on the basis of the Calais decision, as well as like it's basically like I don't know how to say this bluntly without sounding very hyperbolic. Basically, Louisiana is doing this to remove its black representation. That's what's happening. And not a single Republican is going to speak out about this. And very importantly here, especially for the Roberts Court, is that not a single Republican is going to go get up on live television and say, yes, we are redistricting on the basis of race because we just hate African Americans and want to disenfranchise them. No politician in the history of ever, outside of like, even during like the Reconstruction era, when people are just coming to terms with the fact, white people are coming to terms with the fact that like, there are no more enslaved black people. Like, they wouldn't go out there and give stump speeches about how like, yes, we are specifically going to disenfranchise black people. Because even during that time, they wouldn't call themselves like racists. They would just say that they're proud Americans. They just say, oh, we're just, we just want to make sure the most qualified people get into office, And so what I'm trying to say here is that no politician really ever goes in front of a TV camera and says, I'm doing this because I'm racist and I believe in racial discrimination, right? And I want to point this out because that is the one circumstance in which the Voting Rights Act, post the Calais decision, now prohibits like any kind of gerrymandering, right? So, well, you can't redistrict on the basis of you can't redistrict on the basis of race. But if there's significant overlap between, say, a political party and race, you can redistrict along that political party line. Literally, the Supreme Court has ruled, gerrymandering is unconstitutional, but we don't have the remedial power to stop it. Only Congress has that power. And so it is perfectly legal right now for Republicans in the post-Calais world to say, well, we're going to redistrict all of Louisiana, and we're redistricting it to be more favorable to Republicans, and that just so happens to mean that we're going to eliminate all African American representation. That's the thing. They are basically saying we're going to redistrict to be more affirming to ourselves, but in the South, you have to understand the correlation between African American and Democrat is incredibly strong. It is effectively the means by which they are going to return to a Jim Crow era where representation is denied, where voices are marginalized, if not outright ignored, where discriminatory voting practices are reestablished. The Calais decision by the Supreme Court effectively brings back all of the mechanisms, almost all of them at least, that were ended when Jim Crow ended. That's what's happening right now. And there's not really any way to sugarcoat this or make it seem nicer because it's all deeply, deeply messed up. And I do want to also point out here that actually I'm a Southerner and I haven't seen any black candidates for governor. It's not talking about the governor race. It's talking about any black candidates from the South for Congress. We're talking for House of Representatives. We're talking for Senate. We're talking for even state level positions. African American areas could effectively lose their representation. We're talking state and federal level. It is a huge, huge problem. And I mean, Republicans, you can look at this inner exchange here between Sarah Sidner and Scott Jennings on CNN. Just take a watch at this.
Congress, it is not true that the people have decided there is not racism. Let us please not say that, because that's it's incorrect. It is incorrect, Scott. It's not true.
But how is it?
As a member of the black community, I'm telling you, she's
arguing that Congress is somehow. Are you saying our congressional districts are inherently racist today?
No, I'm sorry. The Voting Rights Act was passed by Congress.
Which, by the way, Scott Jennings says that with incredulity. That's also part of the Roberts Court's argument, which is basically having, black opportunity districts that allow for representation of minorities in this country are in fact racist, and therefore they must be done away with in the name of equity, which is, again, absolutely fucking insane.
It's up to Congress to determine whether it should be amended or not. It's not up to the Supreme Court to decide whether it's legal. I'm sorry, 6 Supreme Court justices who all dined with the president last night made this decision, and
you saying they had better and went and wrote it?
No, I'm saying that they're political abstractions. I'm saying that they are acting. I'm sorry, they look like they're acting in response to the political demands of the Republican Party. Because this has been a law.
So your view is they had dinner and then they went back to the court.
My view is that I actually can.
Who is Scott Jennings? Scott Jennings is basically CNN's virulently bigoted conservative that they have on 90% of all of their panel shows.
I just defend myself quickly here to say the following, which is I think a court that actually cared about the independence of the Supreme Court instead of politics would not have 6 people, all appointed by Republicans, go dine with the president yesterday. They do not care about how they look or independence.
For the last 30 years.
Yeah, I do think, by the way, that this is the breaking point for even within Democratic norms, within establishment Democrats. I do think that this is recognized as effectively a political atomic bomb. Even folks like Hakeem Jeffries is responding to this, as if it's a crisis, which he Never does.
And so the guy's falling apart. The MAGA majorities in Congress are falling apart. The Supreme Court is a disgrace. And Ben, in the new Congress, we're going to have to do something about this Supreme Court. And let me be very clear. Everything is on the table. Everything to deal with this corrupt MAGA majority that is issuing political opinions that are designed to bolster the prospects of the Republican Party, and we will not allow them to succeed. And so,
like, you've got Hakeem Jeffries, who just like a few days ago was like, well, impeachment isn't really on the table. Like, he's coming out there and being like, everything is on the table when it comes to the Supreme Court reform. Because the thing is, even the most out of touch Democrats understand that this attack on the African American community is an existential one for the Democratic Party as a whole, right? Like, this is, I mean, like, the civil rights era is functionally when the modern Democratic Party is forged. You have this realignment in the post civil rights world where Democrats, are the party of the left by and large. And like this, the Voting Rights Act is like the core building block of the entire Democratic Party. So even folks who are prone to like not giving a shit about modern, like the way everything is falling apart all the time in this country, they have to give a shit about this. Like, it is a requirement for them to keep their jobs. Even when he's freaking out, he sounds so bored. Yeah, it's true. He does. He's not a great politician. But also, by the way, if you want a better breakdown about growing racial disparities in voter turnout, the Brennan Center for Justice in 2024 put this out, Growing Racial Disparities in Voter Turnout 2008 to 2022. I'm going to link this in chat for you guys because I think it's worth realizing. Just like, it's not just like, oh, the Supreme Court, like, they're just racist and they never figured it out. No, like, I guarantee you, everyone on the Roberts Court is aware of the Brennan Center for Justice report on the fact that racial disparities have grown in the last, decade or so, right? I guarantee you they know about this report. I want you to know how full of shit the Roberts Court is on this particular point, right? I think Jeffries is trying and failing to mimic Obama's cadence. I literally said that yesterday. I agree with you 100%, right? All of this is horrendous. All of this is horrendous. And I gotta be honest, there are not sufficient words for me to talk about how bad this is. Like, me just saying this brings back Jim Crow, I don't know how many people actually realize how bad that is. Outside of like the signifier Jim Crow bad. I don't know how many people realize what this actually translates to. This translates into effectively eliminating, 13, 14% of the country, or maybe like a solid 10% of the voting block of the country in order to support Republicans. It gives Republicans a huge edge in basically all of the elections, especially across the South. It brings back, this level of racial discrimination. It normalizes a level of racial animus and hatred into our system at the expense of minorities. It means that fundamentally today you live in a world that is less free, where you have less representation, a quieter voice, if you are a minority in this country than just a couple days ago. And the scramble to redistrict in Louisiana really indicates how quickly these states want to actually shift back to the way things were. It indicates to me that any of these hand-waving gestures in the name of like, oh, look at how far we've come, the Republican Party is willing to throw all of that progress away. Literally all of it. A lot of folks have claimed it's hyperbole to say that like Republicans want to bring back like slavery, etc. It's not. you can see how it's not hyperbole when you look at the mad scramble to reassert these old, outdated, disgustingly hateful practices. And that's not even touching on the fact that what Republicans want to do as disgustingly hateful practices in the realm of like healthcare, in the realm of foreign policy, in the realm of any aspect of our day-to-day lives. There's a desperation among conservatives to not just end the things that have improved our lives in the modern era, but to bring us back to what ruined countless lives systematically in a previous era, right? It's why you see conservatives constantly pushing bills that would bring back child labor in this country. It's why you constantly see conservatives trying to racially gerrymander the South. It's why you constantly see this long effort that I've described, going back to the end of the Civil War up to today, where you see progress is made, and then from 1870 to like the 1890s, you have the slow dismantling of all of the progress made during the Reconstruction era and the reestablishment or the establishment of what became known as Jim Crow. The re-emergence of the KKK after the Enforcement Acts destroyed it. The reassertion of like this racial supremacy after a brief window where that was no longer the case. And then you see the Herculean effort of millions upon millions of Americans organizing together in order to basically retake human rights and dignity from the mouths of these racists who would destroy it. It's why you needed an ongoing movement for like 25 years to get the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And why you needed that movement to continue. But what happened? What happened after that? Well, kind of the same thing that happened with the Enforcement Acts. You have a country that after these protections are put in place, makes little changes here and there, largely sustains them, and then you have the election of Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan marks the beginning of the end for all of these different progresses. You have folks emerging out of the Reagan era like John Roberts, who is there to try to roll back the clock. And ultimately, he has ascended to a position of power where he and his buddies on the court have been able to do it. So what is to be done? Well, I'm going to leave you with a couple of things for the end of this segment, right? I'm going to play this clip. And this is a clip from Tim Walz's final State of the State address just the other day. And in it, he gives a story, not about, powerful political figures moving mountains, but instead a story about two people, very different from one another in many respects, lending a helping hand. Let's take a listen.
I want to close with just one of those stories that came to my attention. It comes from a Minnesotan I've never met. He calls himself Norm. I don't know if that's his name. I follow him on social media because he's usually talking about sports. But he's also been working in his community to help families who have loved ones abducted during the occupation of Minnesota, raising funds online to help those families stay in their homes despite the loss of their breadwinners. And last week, ICE released one such person from a facility in South Texas. That's good news. The bad news is they released them without any cash, any ID, or any way to get home. So Norm spent the day trying to figure out how to get money to a total stranger to buy a bus ticket to get them home. Then he realized very difficult to get home on Greyhound from South Texas. So eventually Norm decided he'd take matters into his own hands. He bought a ticket on the night's last flight out to Austin. He rented a car. He drove in the rain to pick up a fellow Minnesotan near midnight outside a gas station in some random town in Texas. Paid for a hotel so they stayed overnight. In the morning, Norm took his new friend to Walmart, bought him some new clothes, bought a round of breakfast tacos before flying him back to Minnesota so he could be reunited with his family, including a new baby. On the drive home, Norm wrote online, he said this. He said he got taken in the winter and now it's summer.
And I think that is kind of what we're being called to do in this moment. To extend a basic human decency to one another that in its basicness and in its decency is a fundamental building block for the better world we need to create, that we are called to create by the very brotherhood among our fellow man. It is we who need to right this wrong. And is that right? Is it just? No. But it is our burden. It is also the case that this might be something that is going to take many years to accomplish. Many years of work and effort, years of showing up for one another, years of going to your local meetings for your local Democratic Party, years of extending a helping hand to people who are within your reach that you could help. All right? And it is disgusting what the conservatives of this country have done to us. And it's important that we recognize that this attempt to undo what was built with the blood, sweat, and tears of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, this attempt to undo it is going to persist. And we cannot allow ourselves to put down this burden for the sake of our children, for our children's children, and everyone who comes after. We are obligated to carry this with us. You're going to carry that weight. You know, I see folks talking about Project 2025. It's important to realize that while Project 2025 outlined these goals, these were goals going all the way back to the Southern Strategy. You know, you can look at Nixon's political campaign and the outlining of how they are going to weaponize abortion, how they are going to wake up the evangelical movement in Christianity in America, turning it into a political weapon. You can look at this Southern strategy, and it's been in place for a long, long time here. This is not a one-off. This is not an aberration of the Republican Party. This is their long-term effort and goal. And it is important that we recognize that, because otherwise we could fall into the same thing that our forefathers did. The idea that we have won and the battle is done. And that is a failure. It is a failure of the Civil Rights Act in 1965 to have written into itself that this is going to expire in 5 years. To have required that, like, by 1970, we'll have all of this figured out. And to instead turn the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act into a political football that keeps getting kicked on down the lane. There is no, we are done with making this world better. There is no finishing this fight. It is a weight we are all going to have to carry, and we are all going to have to carry it because we have no choice as to whether or not we will carry it. The people who get to put down this burden, they are people who have a luxury. But it is important for those of us in the world who, are not going to have our votes taken away on the basis of our race because we're white. It's important for those of us to understand that millions of people, millions of our brothers and sisters in this country do not have that luxury. They are under attack by this very ruling. And this weight that we carry, it is not just a burden upon ourselves. It is actually the hope for a better future. Let that hope weigh heavy upon you, but let it inspire you to go out and do better. Because that hope is not bred through a simple sprouting as if naturally. It is bred through work. It is bred through determination. It is bred by trying. And all of us have an obligation to try. And I'm going to end this by reading the words of Congressman George H. White, also known as one of the last Reconstruction era Black men in Congress. This is his farewell address in 1901, when he left Congress knowing full well that the discriminatory efforts of Southern apartheid were going to basically ensure that for the foreseeable future, no black people would be elected to Congress. So I'm going to read you his words now, because I think they're relevant. I want to enter a plea for the colored man, the colored woman, the colored boy, and the colored girl of this country. I would not thus digress from the question at issue and detain the House in a discussion of the interests of this particular people at this time, but for the constant and persistent efforts of certain gentlemen upon this floor to mold and rivet public sentiment against us as a people, and to lose no opportunity to hold up the unfortunate few who commit crimes and depredations and lead lives of infamy and shame, as other races do, as fair specimens of representatives of the entire colored race. In the catalog of members of Congress in this House, perhaps none have been more persistent in their determination to bring black men into disrepute and show that he was unworthy of the right of citizenship than my colleagues from North Carolina, Mr. Kitchen. During the first session of this Congress, he labored long and hard to show that the white race was at all times, under all circumstances, superior to the Negro by inheritance, if not otherwise, and that an illiterate Negro was unfit to participate in making the laws of a sovereign state and the administration and execution of them, but an illiterate white man living by his side with no more, or perhaps not as much property, with no more exalted character, no higher thoughts of civilization, no more knowledge of the handicraft of government, had by birth, because he was white, inherited some peculiar qualification. In the town where this young gentleman was born, at the general election last August for state and county officers, Scotland Neck had a registered white vote of 395, most of whom were Democrats, and a registered colored vote of 534, virtually all of whom were Republican, and so voted. When the count was announced, however, there were 831 Democrats to 75 Republicans. But in the town of Halifax, the same county, the result was much more pronounced. In that town, the registered Republican vote was 345, and the total registered vote of the township was 539. But when the count was announced, it stood at 990 Democrats to 41 Republicans, or 492 more Democratic votes counted than were registered votes in the township. Comment here is unnecessary. It would be unfair, however, for me to leave the inference upon the minds of those who hear me that all of the white people of the state of North Carolina hold views with Mr. Kitchen and think as he does. Thank God there are many noble exceptions to the example he sets, that too in the Democratic Party. Men who have never been afraid that one uneducated, poor, depressed Negro could put to flight and chase into degradation two educated, wealthy, thrifty white men. There never has been, nor never will be, any Negro domination in that state, but no one knows it any better than the Democratic Party. It is a convenient howl, however, often resorted to in order to consummate a diabolical purpose by scaring the weak and gullible whites into support of measures and men suitable to the demagogue. I trust I will be pardoned for making passing references to one more gentleman, Mr. Wilson of South Carolina, who in the early part of this month made a speech, some parts of which did great credit to him. But his purpose was incomplete until he dragged in the Reconstruction days and held up to scorn and ridicule the few ignorant, gullible Negroes who served in the state legislature of South Carolina over 30 years ago. These few ignorant men who chanced at the time to hold office are given as reason why the black man should not be permitted to participate in the affairs of the government, which he is forced to pay taxes to support. If the gentleman to whom I have referred will pardon me, I would like to advance the statement that what the Negro was 32 years ago is not a proper standard by which the Negro living on the threshold of the 20th century should be measured. Since that time, we have reduced the illiteracy rate of the race by at least 45%. We have written and published nearly 500 books. We have nearly 800 newspapers, 3 of which are dailies. We have now in practice over 2,000 lawyers, a corresponding number of doctors. We have accumulated over $12 million worth of school property and $40 million worth of church property. We have 140,000 farms and homes valued at over $750 million and personal property valued about 170 million. We have raised 11 million for educational purposes, and the property per capita of every colored man, woman, and child in the United States is estimated at $75. We are operating successfully several banks, commercial enterprises among our people in the Southland, including one silk mill and one cotton factory. We have 32,000 teachers in the schools of the country. We have built, with the aid of our friends, about 20,000 churches and support 7 colleges, 17 academies, 50 high schools, 5 law schools, 5 medical schools, and 25 theological seminaries. We have over 600,000 acres of land in the South alone. The cotton produced mainly by black labor has increased from 4,669,770 bales in 1860 to 11,235,000 in 1899. All this was done under the most adverse circumstances. We have done it in the face of lynching, burning at the stake, the humiliation of Jim Crow laws, the disenfranchisement of our male citizens, slander and degradation of our women with the factories closed against us, no Negro permitted to be conductor on the railway cars, no Negro permitted to run as engineer on a locomotive, most of the mines closed against us, labor unions, carpenters, painters, brick masons, machinists, hackmen, and those supplying nearly every conceivable avocation for livelihood have banded themselves together to better their conditions, but, with few exceptions, the black face has been left out. The Negroes are seldom employed in our mercantile stores. With all these odds against us, we are forging our way ahead, slowly, perhaps, but surely. You may use our labor for 2.5 centuries and then taunt us for our poverty, but let me remind you, we will not always remain poor. You may withhold even the knowledge of how to read God's word and then taunt us for our ignorance, but we would remind you that there is plenty of room at the top, and we are climbing. Mr. Chairman, before concluding my remarks, I would submit a brief recipe for the solution of the so-called American Negro problem. He asks no special favors, but simply demands that he be given the same chance for existence, for earning a livelihood, for raising himself in the scales of manhood and womanhood that are accorded to kindred nationalities. Treat him as a man. Open the doors of industry to him, help him to overcome his weakness, punish the crime committing class by the courts of the land, measure the standard of the race by its best material, cease to mold prejudicial and unjust public sentiments against him, and he will learn to support and join in with that political party, that institution, whether secular or religious, in every community where he lives, which is destined to do the greatest good for the greatest number. Obliterate race hatred, party prejudice, and help us to achieve nobler ends, greater results, and become satisfactory citizens to our brothers in white. This, Mr. Chairman, is perhaps the Negro's temporary farewell to the American Congress, but Phoenix-like, he will rise up someday and come again. Those are the last words uttered by a black member of Congress for the next several decades. And we find ourselves now in a very similar position. If you think that it is not possible for us to fall back to that same circumstance, I just remind you that the one law that really prevents us from falling back to that exact circumstance has utterly been defanged. And so we all have to ask ourselves, which side are you on? Are you on the side of people who would bring us backwards, who would disenfranchise your brothers and sisters to make yourself feel more powerful by comparison? Or are you on the side of equality? Are you on the side of equal rights for all? And will you now, in this moment of crisis, extend your hand to those around you, those who need help, both politically and economically, in all ways? Extend the hand of friendship and fellowship to those who right now sorely need our help, our solidarity, and our fighting spirit. Because, to quote that letter from a Selma jail, your help can be a message of unity which the thickest jail walls cannot muffle. And to quote once more Mr. George H. White, or to paraphrase, I suppose, Phoenix-like, we will rise up someday and come again. So, all that being said, folks, What is required of us now is to organize. The problem is as it ever has been, and the solution is as it ever has been. It is the organizing of common everyday people, you and me, all of us together, coming together and doing what we can do to make the world a better place, to fight back against this inequity, and to band together, not just as communities, but as a movement. For if it took the civil rights movement, the coordinated effort, in order to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965, so too will it take a movement of people who hold hands in solidarity, who help one another in solidarity, who have looked for the helpers and found them, to rise up and move until we have victory resounding in every state of this union, in every legislature of this union, in every hall of power. We must hold hands together and say in one voice that we demand equality, we demand equity, we demand to be treated as human beings. So, all that being said, folks, if you need help getting involved in your local Democratic Party, if you need help getting involved in your local DSA, two groups that will be and are actively already moving on this issue, we can help you do that. Join your local Democrats, make them more progressive, make them angrier. This is something you should be furious about. Join your local Dems. Share that fury with like-minded folks. Join your local DSA. Share that fire with like-minded folks. Organize. 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 Because if you sit in apathy, this is a cancer that will grow. So organize. And with all that being said, join our Discord. We can help you get set up with your local Dems and your local DSA. Reach out to Gamergy for help with DSA. Reach out to Dragonfly for help with your local Dems. Now is the time to get involved. If you've been sitting on the sidelines, if you've merely been knowing the correct things but not doing the organizing, now is the time for all of us to be involved in that good work, that organizing labor. Let's get to it. It's a lot of work, but you know what? As working people, we're pretty good at doing work. So if you got anything out of this, like this video, leave a comment. Comments longer than 8 words really help in the algorithm. You know, I might do another segment on this where I read Justice Kagan's dissent. Like, comment, subscribe, do the things. Check out ImogeneOlivia.com, gender euphoric lingerie. Link down in the description. It's cool as hell. And let's keep on going. Heads held high, and hope weighing us down. Enjoy.
Riverboat Jack is coming to town. All the viewers gather round. Twitch and YouTube and swishy streams. All that content is bursting the seams. Politics, being plenty more. Your sense of fashion you'll adore. So grab your stuff and hop aboard. We're going straight to Jack's Discord. Riverboat.